The hardwood floor echoed with Max's every step as he entered his home, the sound stark against the heavy silence of the spacious living room. The late evening glow of a solitary lamp cast elongated shadows across the minimalist furniture. But what drew Max's attention was the low hum of voices. A woman's laugh. A touch too effervescent to be casual, reached his ears, mingling with a man's smooth baritone. Max set his suitcase down with deliberate care, the soft click of the handle folding away, punctuating the tension hanging in the air. He adjusted his tie, his sharp gaze narrowing as he moved toward the archway leading to the living room. The scene he encountered stopped him cold, though he did not flinch. Camille, his wife, perched elegantly on the edge of the sofa, her manicured fingers loosely wrapped around the stem of a half-empty wineglass. Across from her sat a man Max didn't recognize, young, confident, his casual attire almost mocking the refined atmosphere of Max's home. The stranger leaned forward, his posture intimate, his hand dangerously close to Camille's on the couch. "Don't let me interrupt," Max announced, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. Camille's eyes widened, her expression a cocktail of surprise and something else. Guilt? The man straightened abruptly, masking his discomfort with an arrogant smirk. "Max, you're home early," Camille stammered, recovering her composure with practiced ease. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her silk blouse. "This is, Peter, a colleague from the charity gala." Max allowed a faint smile to curl his lips, the warmth failing to reach his eyes. "A pleasure, Peter. I'm sure you've heard all about me." Peter opened his mouth to respond, but Max was already stepping forward, his hand extended in a firm handshake that made the younger man wince. Camille interjected hastily. Peter was just leaving. "Weren't you?" The air crackled with tension as Peter hesitated, but the steel in Max's gaze made his decision for him. "Of course," Peter muttered, retreating with an awkward nod. Max watched the man depart, before turning back to Camille, his expression inscrutable. "Now," he said, loosening his tie as he settled into an armchair, "why don't you tell me about this gala colleague of yours?" Camille's polished facade cracked as the front door clicked shut behind Peter. Her eyes darted toward Max, searching for a cue in his expression, a flicker of anger, an opening for sympathy. She found neither. Instead, Max leaned back in his chair, his posture deceptively relaxed, the faintest smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "So," he began, his tone light, almost conversational, "Peter seems spirited." He swirled an imaginary glass in the air as if mimicking the man's demeanor. "What exactly is his role at the charity?" Camille hesitated, her hand tightening around the wineglass she had yet to set down. "He's one of the coordinators," she said finally, her voice steady but too quick. "You know how these events are, a lot of moving parts. Sometimes you have to collaborate closely." "Clearly," Max replied with a dry chuckle. He rose from the chair, strolling to the liquor cabinet and pouring himself a neat scotch. The sharp sound of the stopper hitting the counter punctuated the quiet. "And this collaboration, does it often involve private conversations on our couch long after work hours?" Camille's fingers twitched, her polished exterior struggling to hold. "Max," she began, her voice adopting a coaxing tone, "you've been traveling so much lately. I've had to take on extra responsibilities with the gala. It's nothing more than that." "Extra responsibilities," Max mused, turning the phrase over as if tasting it for himself. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "Interesting choice of words." The silence stretched, filling the space between them like a physical presence. Camille turned toward the window, a calculated move to avoid his scrutiny. She stared at the city skyline, her reflection faint in the glass. "I don't understand why you're acting this way," she said finally, her voice tinged with exasperation. "Can't a woman have a colleague over without it being an inquisition?" "An inquisition?" Max echoed, his tone still maddeningly calm. He approached her slowly, his footsteps measured. "Camille, let's not play games. I know a business conversation when I hear one, and that," he gestured toward the couch with his glass, "that was no business conversation." She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "Are you seriously accusing me of something? Because if you are, you'd better say it outright." Max leaned against the wall, crossing his arms, the faintest shadow of a smile on his face. "Oh, I'm not accusing you of anything," he said smoothly. "I'm just observing, like how Peter didn't bother to stand when I walked in. Very casual, don't you think? Almost as if he thought he belonged here." "And then there's you," Max interrupted, his voice soft but razor-edged. "The way your hand shook when you set down your glass. The way you glanced at the clock just before I walked in. Tell me, Camille, were you expecting someone else?" Her breath hitched, betraying her, but she quickly masked it with a derisive laugh. "This is absurd. You're making something out of nothing." Max took a final sip of his scotch, placing the glass deliberately on the windowsill. His sharp eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time that evening, his smile disappeared. "Let's hope you're right, Camille," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Because nothing is the last thing I'll accept." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the glow of the city lights, the tension simmering around her like a storm waiting to break. The house was silent again, save for the faint ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Max retreated to his study, shutting the door with a deliberate click. Camille's words echoed in his head, fragments of excuses, deflections, and carefully rehearsed indifference. He sat down at his desk, his fingers drumming against the dark mahogany as he considered his next move. From his pocket, Max retrieved his phone, unlocking it with a swipe. The messages he'd found earlier that day sat glaringly on the screen. They had been the first sign, cryptic but damning enough to spark his early return. "Can't wait for tonight. Same place?" "He'll never know. He's busy as always." They lacked names but spoke volumes, revealing a dynamic far too personal to be professional. Max had hesitated before acting on them, giving Camille the benefit of the doubt, but Peter's casual arrogance had confirmed what the messages had only hinted at. He opened a secure app and began scrolling through a series of other texts and call logs that he'd compiled over the last few weeks. There was a pattern, a rhythm to the betrayal, predictable and deliberate. Each new thread added to his growing sense of clarity. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Max didn't look up. "Come in." Camille stepped inside, her movements hesitant but deliberate. She had replaced her earlier sharpness with a carefully crafted vulnerability. "Max, we need to talk," she began, her voice measured. Max leaned back in his chair, his expression impassive. "Go on." She approached cautiously, folding her arms in front of her like a shield. "I don't like how we left things earlier. I feel like you're looking for problems where there aren't any." "Is that so?" Max's voice was calm, but the edge beneath it made her shift uncomfortably. "Tell me, Camille, what exactly was Peter doing here tonight? Spare me the charity coordinator routine." Camille hesitated, her composure faltering for a brief moment before she forced a laugh. "He was dropping off documents for the gala. I told you, it's nothing." Max's sharp gaze pinned her in place. "Dropping off documents? Funny, I didn't see a single piece of paper in his hands, not so much as a folder." Her face tightened, the cracks in her carefully maintained facade beginning to show. "Do you even hear yourself? You've been working too much, Max. You're stressed, and now you're inventing scenarios that don't exist." Max leaned forward, his tone dangerously low. "Oh, I hear myself just fine. Do you hear yourself, Camille? Because it sounds an awful lot like a lie." Camille stiffened, her jaw tightening. "This is ridiculous. If you can't trust me—" "It's not about trust anymore," Max interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest. "It's about answers." He rose from his chair, his presence looming. "The next time you want to invite someone into my home," he said coldly, "make sure you're better at covering your tracks." Camille's expression wavered between anger and fear as Max brushed past her, leaving the room without a backward glance. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the house, as certain as the storm he was about to unleash. The hours after Max's departure ticked by slowly. Camille sat alone on the couch, a wine-glass long forgotten. The warm glow of the lamp barely softened the cold, oppressive silence that had settled over the room. Every creak of the house made her startle, her mind racing with scenarios of what Max might do next. He was always so calculated, so maddeningly composed. Upstairs, Max stared at the messages on his phone again, memorizing every detail. The timestamps, the casual tone, the lack of caution, all of it told him that this wasn't a fleeting indiscretion. It was deliberate, planned. If there had been any doubt before, Peter's smug demeanor had erased it. Max clenched his fists, his mind whirring with options. He could have walked away, but that would be too simple, too clean. Camille needed to understand the depth of what she had destroyed. He descended the stairs with the same deliberate steps that had unnerved Camille earlier. She turned sharply as he entered the living room, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "Max," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you coming to bed?" Max didn't respond immediately. Instead, he paced the room, his hands in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over the familiar details of their home. The designer furniture, the carefully chosen artwork. Each piece told a story of a life he thought they had built together. "Camille," he said finally, his tone cool but firm, "how long have we been married?" "Camille." She blinked, startled by the unexpected question. 12 years. "Why?" 12 years, Max repeated, his voice soft, as though tasting the words. "And in all that time, did you ever stop to consider how much I trusted you?" Her mouth opened, then closed again, unable to find the right response. "You don't need to answer," Max continued, his voice growing sharper. "'Cause the text you didn't bother to delete, the way Peter acted tonight, and the stories that don't quite line up, they already have." Camille's eyes widened, panic flickering across her face. "You're being paranoid. Those texts are innocent, Max. Peter is just—" "Don't," Max snapped, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by pretending I'm imagining this. I've spent my entire career reading people, spotting inconsistencies. Do you really think I can't see through you?" Her panic shifted to anger, her voice rising defensively. "You've been gone half the time, Max. Always off on some business trip, barely present. You don't get to act like the wounded party when you've been absent for most of this marriage." Max stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "That's quite the justification," he said softly. "But it's not going to work." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "Because I've seen the messages, Camille. I know exactly how much of our marriage has been a facade, and now I'm done pretending." He walked to the door, grabbing his coat without looking back. "You wanted more freedom. Congratulations. You have it. Let's see how far it takes you." The door closed behind him with a finality that left Camille staring into the empty space, her protests dying in her throat. The echo of the closing door reverberated through the house like a gunshot, leaving Camille in stunned silence. For a moment, she sat motionless, the weight of Max's words settling on her shoulders. The wineglass trembled in her hand, and she set it down carefully, afraid it might shatter. Max, always controlled, had walked out, without raising his voice, without a single gesture of violence. And yet, it was his composure that terrified her the most, that cold, deliberate anger. Camille knew him well enough to realize that this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Upstairs, Max sat in his car, his grip tight on the steering wheel as he stared out at the darkened street. The betrayal churned in his gut, but his mind remained clear. Years of analyzing strategies, anticipating moves, and staying 2 steps ahead in business had prepared him for this moment. He wasn't leaving Camille out of impulse. He was leaving because it was time to act. He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "David," he said, his voice steady. "It's time. Activate the contingency plan I mentioned. I want everything finalized by tomorrow morning." David, his trusted lawyer and confidant, didn't ask for clarification. "Understood. I'll have the documents ready for your signature." Max ended the call and leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. This wasn't just about ending his marriage. It was about reclaiming control. If Camille thought she could dismantle their life together without consequence, she had grossly underestimated him. Inside the house, Camille began to move frantically, her mind racing. She needed to get ahead of this, to salvage whatever she could. Grabbing her phone, she typed out a message to Peter, her fingers shaking. "Max knows, he's gone, but it's bad. Call me." But as she pressed send, a new message popped up from an unknown number. "Mrs. Harrington, this is a courtesy notice. Please be advised that all joint accounts and assets are now frozen, pending further legal proceedings." Her breath caught, and she reread the message, her heart pounding. She darted to her laptop, opening their shared financial accounts, but each attempt to log in was met with an access denied notice. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Max hadn't just walked out in anger. He had planned this. Every move, every word had been calculated. Meanwhile, Max drove through the quiet streets, his destination clear. He pulled into the driveway of his closest friend, Daniel, who greeted him with a knowing nod. "I heard," Daniel said simply, stepping aside to let Max in. Max sank into a chair, exhaling for what felt like the first time in hours. "I need a place to regroup," he said. "Just until this is done." Daniel clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Stay as long as you need." Back at the house, Camille stared at her phone, her mind a whirlwind of panic and regret. The control she thought she had was slipping away faster than she could grasp it. And for the first time, she realized the full weight of what she had lost.